You hear it before you see it, the tremor of hooves rippling through the ground beneath your bare feet. The scent of crushed grass mingles with smoke. Somewhere behind you, a doll carved from wood lies face down in the dirt, one painted eye staring toward the mountains you'll never reach. You run, but the sound swells until it fills the world. To everyone watching from every corner of the world, whether you're in Jakarta or Johannesburg, London or Lahore, thank you for joining us on this journey into history's darkest corridors. We are building a global community of learners and storytellers who believe history deserves to be told without filters. If you're here for truth told through cinematic storytelling, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Together, we uncover the past that power tried to erase. Long before the great domes of Istanbul glimmered beneath the morning sun, caravans moved silently across the frontiers of empire. Their cargo was not gold nor grain, but people. By the 15th century, the Ottoman slave trade had become one of the most organized systems of human acquisition in the early modern world. It stretched from the Black Sea steppes to the Red Sea ports, feeding a machine that demanded women and girls for labor, concubinage, and display. To understand its reach, one must first understand its cold efficiency. The Ottoman state did not merely tolerate slavery, it managed it. The empire's bureaucrats recorded every sale, every tax, every name that changed from person to property. The same ink that signed treaties and decrees also marked the fate of children torn from their homes. The journey often began in the highlands of Circassia, Georgia, or Abkhazia, lands once described by travelers as gardens of beauty. Here, local chieftains, impoverished by war and famine, made uneasy bargains with Ottoman and Crimean intermediaries. Raiders descended on villages at dawn, seizing girls barely into adolescence. A Jesuit observer wrote of one such raid in 1620. They took them not as spoils of war, but as harvest. The term was literal. The raids coincided with the season when the fields were full and the men were far away. From these frontiers, the captives were herded in chains down mountain paths. Those who stumbled were struck or left behind. The survivors reached the ports of Trebizond, Sinop, or Kaffa, grim thresholds where innocence was priced in silver. Ottoman customs officers inspected the human cargo as if it were livestock, assigning values by skin tone, age, and obedience. The state collected a 10% duty on every sale, recorded meticulously in the defters, imperial ledgers that still survive in fragments today. These documents speak in numbers, but between their lines lie screams. One record from 1658 lists 4 Circassian maidens, untrained, fair of face, sold for 2,800 akçe each. Another notes a Nubian girl of 16, purchased for service in the kitchens of Galata. The language is sparse, almost tender in its precision, proof that bureaucracy can sound merciful while masking atrocity. Merchants grew rich in the trade. Among them were the kulolus, families who straddled commerce and governance. They operated through guilds with their own internal codes and arbitration courts. Their caravans moved under the protection of the Sultan's insignia, blending legality and brutality into one seamless enterprise. When disputes arose, over price, over possession, the empire's judges did not ask whether the trade was moral, but whether the contract had been honored. A Venetian envoy visiting Istanbul in the 17th century described the slave markets as hives of murmured bargaining. He wrote, "They bring the girls forward one by one. The air smells of sweat and rosewater. Their faces are expressionless, as if carved from wax. Beneath the domed roofs of these markets, humanity was stripped to inventory. Traders pressed fingers into women's arms to test for softness, pulled hair to judge health, inspected teeth for youth. The women were silent, not because they accepted their fate, but because the language of protest no longer existed within this ritual. The Ottomans called it kul sistemi, the system of servants. But it was service without consent, devotion extracted by terror. Some captives were absorbed into the palaces of Istanbul, where they became concubines or attendants. Others were scattered across Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, vanishing into households whose records history never kept. Yet everywhere the same pattern repeated: ownership registered, taxes collected, obedience demanded. What makes this machinery even more chilling is its rationality. In the imperial imagination, slavery was not an aberration, but a necessity, a way to bring order from chaos. Religious scholars issued fatwas declaring that captives from non-Muslim lands could be lawfully enslaved, transforming conquest into divine commerce. The state's accountants then translated that theology into revenue. Faith justified profit. Profit sustained faith. Occasionally, the silence broke. A letter survives from a Genoese trader imprisoned in Constantinople in 1583, who wrote, "They sell the girls as one sells silk. A child from the mountains fetched more than a horse. The smallest wept until her voice failed. None dared comfort her." By the late 17th century, the trade had become self-perpetuating. Entire generations of intermediaries, Tatars, Greeks, Arabs, Jews, participated in its economy. Each link profited, each claimed necessity, and each looked away from the suffering beneath the coins. Even the victims' parents were sometimes complicit, surrendering children to pay debts or secure protection. What begins as survival ends as system. In the empire's capital, where the Bosporus shimmered like a blade beneath the morning sun, the culmination of this trade played out daily. Slave auctions unfolded within shouting distance of mosques and courts, symbols of divine justice standing beside the commerce of flesh. To the empire's administrators, there was no contradiction. The state saw order, not cruelty, law, not horror, and so the ledgers grew heavier. The markets expanded. The empire of shadows deepened. For every palace dancer or concubine history remembers, thousands more vanished into kitchens, fields, and brothels. Their names erased, their stories replaced by numbers that scholars now study like fossils of forgotten grief. But within those numbers lies a question the empire never dared ask. What happens to a civilization that teaches itself to measure humanity in currency? The Ottomans built their glory on faith, art, and conquest, but beneath it all ran a darker current, steady and relentless. When the caravans moved at dusk, they looked almost beautiful from a distance. Lines of torches snaking through valleys, reflected in rivers. Yet for every light that flickered, a childhood was being carried away. The empire called it trade. History remembers it as something else entirely. The shadow had only just begun to spread. Dawn breaks over Istanbul like molten gold poured across domes and minarets. The call to prayer drifts over the Bosporus, gentle and devout, but behind the high marble walls of Topkapi Palace, the day begins in silence. Curtains of silk flutter in the faint sea breeze, carrying the scent of rosewater and fear. Here, within this gilded labyrinth, hundreds of women wake to a world they cannot leave, a world that history would later romanticize but which in truth was built from captivity. The imperial harem was the empire's most secret institution, a domain invisible to the public and yet vital to the machinery of power. At its heart stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, commanding respect that rivaled viziers and generals. Beneath her stretched a hierarchy so intricate it could have been designed by an engineer of souls: concubines, attendants, laundresses, musicians, guards, all bound by rules older than memory. To outsiders it appeared serene, even divine. But within it was a prison disguised as paradise. For every jeweled curtain and polished corridor, there was an equal measure of dread. New arrivals entered through a narrow gate known as the caravanserai door. There, an overseer recorded their names, only to erase them. The girls were stripped of their birth identities, baptized anew in the language of obedience. Circassian, Georgian, Albanian, Sudanese. Their origins vanished beneath Ottoman names that sounded like music but meant possession. "You are no longer who you were," the mistress of novices might whisper, her tone both soothing and final. Training began immediately. The young were taught to walk in silence, to bow with elegance, to speak only when spoken to. They learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian verses of poetry and prayer. The older ones were taught the rhythms of music, the choreography of charm. Yet behind the elegance lay relentless control. Disobedience meant the loss of privileges. Silks replaced by coarse linen. Rooms replaced by dark storage chambers where voices went unheard. Punishment was not always violent. Sometimes it was worse. Isolation could break the will faster than any whip. The Sultan's household called it education. The women called it forgetting. Each night, the harem came alive like a hidden city. Laughter echoed down corridors, music drifted from the training rooms, and yet beneath it all throbbed a quiet anxiety. Every woman lived in the shadow of the Khalfa, the senior attendants who enforced discipline with gentle cruelty. They ensured that every glance toward the Sultan was measured, every movement rehearsed. A single misstep, a gaze held too long, a smile too bold, could mean demotion or expulsion. Those who pleased him might ascend to power. Those who faltered disappeared into service positions, never to be mentioned again. The paradox of the harem was this. The women within it were powerless, yet some held influence vast enough to shape the empire. Figures like Hurrem Sultan, once Roxolana, a Ukrainian captive, rose from enslavement to become the most powerful woman in the Ottoman world. Her story, repeated in whispers, became both aspiration and warning. To rise was to be loved by the Sultan. To be loved was to be watched by all. Rivalries burned behind smiles. Women poisoned rivals with rosewater perfumes, bribed eunuchs for secret information, and cultivated allies among scribes and servants. Every friendship hid calculation. Every kindness concealed strategy. A traveler who glimpsed the harem's exterior might have seen serenity, gardens of cypress and fountains murmuring in the courtyards. But the sound of water also masked the whispers of fear. The black eunuchs, castrated guards brought from East Africa, moved soundlessly through corridors, symbols of total control. Their loyalty belonged to the Sultan and the Valid alone. One European ambassador wrote in disbelief, "Even the air seems trained to obedience within those walls." At the heart of this golden prison was the privy chamber, where the Sultan held private audiences and occasionally chose his companions for the night. The ritual was cloaked in ceremony. Women selected for presentation were bathed in scented oils, dressed in layered silks, and adorned with jewels heavy enough to bruise their skin. As they waited, each heard her own heartbeat echo louder than the flutes outside. The chamber doors opened with the weight of destiny. For one, it meant ascendancy. For another, exile to a forgotten wing. Some chroniclers believed the Sultan's affection was a form of divine selection. Others knew better. It was a game of control disguised as affection, desire weaponized into obedience. A concubine favored by the ruler became untouchable, until she wasn't. When her beauty faded or her influence waned, she could be transferred to a provincial palace, married off to a loyal official, or simply made to vanish. The harem consumed youth as fuel for empire. Outside, Istanbul thrived, ships arriving from Alexandria, spices perfuming the air, scholars debating theology in courtyards. None spoke openly of the women behind Topkapi's latticed screens, yet the empire's stability often hinged upon them. Through pillow talk and maternal influence, they guided decisions that shaped wars, treaties, and dynasties. The harem was not merely a place of confinement. It was the empire's secret council chamber, where affection and strategy became indistinguishable. Still, the psychological toll was inescapable. Many women grew old within those walls, never glimpsing the city beyond. Some composed melancholy songs, verses about rivers they would never see again, stars glimpsed through lattices that cut the sky into fragments. An Ottoman record mentions a concubine who petitioned the Valid Sultan for permission to see the sea just once before her death. The request was denied. In the quiet hours before dawn, the harem returned to silence. Lanterns dimmed, silk rustled, prayers whispered into pillows. Beyond the latticework, the Bosporus shimmered, indifferent and eternal. The empire's poets wrote of the harem as paradise. Its victims might have called it purgatory. For those women, freedom existed only in dreams, and even dreams had walls. The old slave markets of Istanbul are quiet now. Tourists wander through alleys where the air once shook with bargaining, their footsteps echoing off stones that remember more than they reveal. At first glance, nothing remains, just shuttered archways and the faint scent of the sea drifting from the Golden Horn. Yet if one listens long enough, the silence speaks. It whispers names no archive preserved. When the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922, it buried its ghosts beneath proclamations of progress. The new republic declared slavery abolished, and the ledgers that once priced human lives vanished overnight. But erasure conceals. It does not cleanse. Diplomats and historians later stumbled upon fragments that refused to die. Forgotten registries of women's names and prices, travel diaries describing auctions long after bans, and letters from former slaves begging for acknowledgement. One such letter, preserved in the British archives, came from a woman named Miriam. She wrote from Izmir in 1888, "They tell me I am free, yet my owner still calls me his wife. He says the law cannot unmake what God has made." Her words exposed the empire's hypocrisy, abolition in principle, enslavement in practice. Under European scrutiny, Ottoman officials outlawed the trade, yet in private homes it endured, sanctified by custom and silence. Resistance flickered within the empire's own courts. Enslaved women petitioned Islamic judges for manumission, invoking mistreatment or a dead master's promise of freedom. Some succeeded. Court notes reveal one judge writing, "The petitioner, once a slave, seeks liberty not as rebellion, but as justice." But even freedom was fragile. Many freed women were re-enslaved, trapped in cycles where servitude and liberty became indistinguishable. Beyond the empire's borders, abolitionists recorded what Istanbul denied. British and French observers reported that slave markets had gone underground, transactions now conducted behind courtyard walls, under candlelight instead of sun. The trade in Circassian women, especially, persisted into the early 1900s. An Austrian traveler wrote of ladies of refinement, sold for elite households in Cairo and Damascus, masked as servants. Civilization's veneer hid a commerce that refused to die. But not all stories were written. Some remain etched into architecture. In Galata and Üsküdar, houses still stand with hidden courtyards and narrow lattice windows where enslaved women once lived unseen. Oral traditions in the Caucasus recall ancestors who vanished into the empire, their descendants tracing lineage through rumor and inherited songs. For many, history became a form of excavation, digging through silence to reclaim stolen names. By the early 1900s, the empire's moral seams began to split. Reformers whispered of decay. Scholars debated whether slavery was divine right or sin. One imam, writing anonymously in 1908, declared, "If the Prophet freed his slaves, who are we to bind ours?" His pamphlet, banned by censors, rippled through the city like a quiet confession. Yet the new reformers who seized power spoke of modernization, not repentance. The enslaved had no place in the national myth they were building. Western observers later proclaimed slavery ended in Ottoman lands, mistaking silence for success. But many former slaves remained within the same households, their freedom conditional upon obedience. Others vanished into poverty, unmoored from identity or kinship. The empire's bureaucratic precision had achieved a cruel perfection. Paper erased what it once recorded. Still, traces endured. In the archives of Vienna, receipts list 3 Circassian girls to the house of Mehmed Pasha. In Cairo's libraries, letters reveal merchants seeking trained women for palace service as late as 1910. These were the dying breaths of a centuries-old system. Commerce cloaked in civility, persisted through denial. Today, historians reconstruct fragments of their existence, yet much remains unknowable. How many lived and died unseen? How many resisted, not through rebellion, but endurance? Empires leave behind marble and metal, but human suffering leaves subtler marks. In lullabies once sung by enslaved mothers, in family names quietly changed to escape the past. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its echoes linger. In mosque courtyards where sunlight filters through lattices that once shielded the unseen. In Cairo's markets, where earth still yields coins stamped with sultans' faces. And in the voices of modern descendants who whisper of ancestors taken south and never returned. The past does not sleep. It exhales beneath our feet. One question endures. If an empire can erase its crimes from memory, what of those who inherit its silence? The Ottomans built monuments to their conquests, but none to their captives. Yet every stone in their cities was laid by hands history refused to name. As dusk settles over the Bosporus, the wind threads through the alleys of the old slave quarter. No cries remain, only the hum of life above the quiet. Somewhere in that wind are the voices of the forgotten, soft and unyielding. They are not gone. They are waiting to be heard.